welcome to Policy and Politics with me, Tarun Nangia. Today we are going to discuss India, India's neighborhood, America, China, Russia. The American angle is very important when we discuss India's neighborhood because India's relationship with America also has an impact on India's relationship in its neighborhood, as is evident these days. But I'm not an expert on this subject, but my guest today is. I have got Abhijit Iyer Mitra, who's Senior Fellow, Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, joining me today on this episode of Policy and Politics. I would like to welcome Abhijit on the show and want to thank him for sparing his time for Policy and Politics today.
Thanks for having me on, Tarun. Always a pleasure talking to you.
So Abhijit, in about 2 minutes or so, China is up at the border. In fact, not only in Ladakh, but all across the border areas way up to Arunachal Pradesh. That is all known now. But what led to all of this? There is a lot of talk that India's growing relations and strengthening relations with USA has caused a bit of a concern in Beijing. Is that true, or we are getting it all wrong?
I think the first problem is when we begin to see reason in China's actions. It's a bit like the battered wife syndrome, where a battered wife constantly seeks reason for what did she do to get beaten up by the husband. I think what we know about China is that historically, and I think there's a book about this, China's Strategic Culture by Alistair Ian Johnston, that China, when it is weak, will never attack, and it portrays its sort of pacifism as virtue. And the moment they get strong, they always attack. This has been an unchanging historical pattern over the last 2,200 years. And it applies to every single dynasty, the Ming, the Qing, the Tang, the Qin, and now the CCP dynasty as well. So what you've seen is that it's also been helped by unprecedented wealth. Of course, all of this is precarious because they're now stuck in a middle income trap. And the unprecedented accumulation of power. Even Deng Xiaoping hadn't managed to accumulate as much power as Xi Jinping has. So these would be the main reasons. And we shouldn't really look for why. It's a historical pattern.
Okay, so you mean that we should have been well prepared and well aware of what's to come. But I want to know from you, as a lot of people who watch you on this subject, what has changed for India geopolitically in the past 24 months? China being one issue, but what has changed? Because suddenly, we are doing so well in kind of perception terms. Our Prime Minister was going to all these countries. In fact, he met Xi Jinping so many times. Suddenly, it seems like things are crumbling suddenly, and it takes a lot of people by surprise who don't follow the small signs as well. And even I don't, a lot of us don't. Can you share with us why?
Sure. So one thing, and this is kind of, before I move on to West Asia and Pakistan, this is a corollary to what I was saying about China. Now, all of us made this mistake of assuming that China has become a modern state that follows all these modern norms. It signs treaties and adheres to them and so on and so forth. It follows the modern interpretation of international relations. In fact, I used to go to several conferences in Delhi where they said, look, China has sorted out all its boundary problems with everyone except India and Bhutan, of course, which was seen as sort of an ancillary of India. And today, of course, we know that is not true because they've sorted out all their land border problems. And very dangerously, they've sort of, transposed land definitions of boundaries onto the seas based on pre-modern cartography maps, which won't hold in any court of law because they don't follow any modern cartographic norms, onto the South China Sea and so on and so forth. If you notice, they've also, signed on to the NPT and so on and so forth, and they continue to violate it blatantly. Everybody will tell you that in private. It's just that China becomes such a big market. Nobody wants to antagonize them by saying it out in public. So this is something we have to keep in mind in the back of our minds with China. But what has changed most significantly for us in the last 24 odd months has been West Asia and Pakistan. I don't think Pakistan has ever been as internationally isolated today as it has been today ever. Several things. You look at Imran Khan, his only allies seem to be Mahathir Mohamad, who is also no longer left, and Erdogan in Turkey, who himself is beleaguered. His Turkey's relationship with NATO is in deep trouble. You look at all the Gulf Sunni states except for Qatar. They've executed a full-on 180-degree change in policy. Of course, it's part of a larger realignment because they've also, made up with Israel now. Saudi Arabia, for all effects and purposes, is an Israeli ally at the moment. And it is also the foundations of a long-lasting alliance because there are investment talks going on. There are mutual investment and trade talks going on, which are going to be very, very significant. And it can, if anything, it's so mutually productive because you look at the UAE, it actually built a knowledge and a mercantile economy. Unlike Saudi Arabia, which is going down the human value addition chain now after Mohammed bin Sultan. I keep calling him Mohammed bin Sultan. He's Mohammed bin Salman, but that's more of a political thing because they hate being called a sultanate, but they have become a sultanate for all effects and purposes. So excuse the pun. I've internalized the pun so much, but so that's the second big thing. The third big thing that we've seen is it's more of a cyclic pattern that Republican administrations of late tend to be much closer to India than Democrat administrations are. You remember how far George Bush went to give us the Indo-US nuclear deal. And, Obama never even put in half that effort for getting India the NSG membership. So what you see now is Trump, when this whole Galwan Valley incident happened in June, if you remember, Trump sent down 2 aircraft carrier battle groups into the South China Sea. Unprecedented. They sent one against us, the 7th Fleet in 1971 that everyone wants to talk about. They sent in one aircraft carrier battle group when the Taiwan Straits crisis, when Taiwan had its first democratic elections, I think that was in 97. Not its first democratic elections, but its first non-rigged democratic elections in 1997. So these are all the changes that we're seeing. And I think it's that sweet spot where all the good things are converging at once.
So I want to know from you this one thing. I remember we recorded an episode not too long ago speaking about how America's foreign policy has put Russia into China's orbit, which is now truly come true. Russia is truly and well into China's orbit. Russian ministers make more rounds to China than any other country. I mean, there is 6, 8, 10 times a year Russian ministers are flying to Beijing more than any other place. What is happening now? Is Russia's closeness to China also affecting our neighborhood and us in a sense?
Yes and no. See, the Russians, for one, have always been a bit upset with us cozying up to the Americans, but they've never been crude or uncivilized about it.
Yes.
The problem is Russia has its own weaknesses, which it understands because, the IMF deal that it got after the breakup of the Soviet Union was that Russia would focus on services and not in manufacturing. So it missed out on a whole manufacturing cycle. And its industries are now decrepit and, they're obsolete pretty much. There is nothing that Russia produces that other countries can't do better, unfortunately. And surprisingly, it was China that went down the manufacturing path and Russia that decided to concentrate on services at almost exactly the same time. Remember 1990-91 thing. And today, China's per capita income is almost the same as Russia's. So there is this fundamental issue with Russia. Now, Russia understands that it is in a monopsony situation where it's only got one real buyer, which is China. With India, they're looking for India to, somehow grow, become bigger, which is why they tolerate us cozying up to America, because the bigger a market we get, the more we can buy from them and break that sort of monopsony.
That's where I have one more question for you. Sorry to interrupt. Americans think by and large we are giving them a raw deal. In my interactions, they say that, if you look at the trade deficit with America vis-a-vis a trade deficit with China, the Americans are upset with us. They might not say in as many words, but they say that China is kicking you in the shin and you are awarding them, with the kind of business that nobody gives. But to America, you're giving us the treatment as if we are not exactly. In fact, it should be reversed.
So I'm going to give you a very controversial psychological opinion. If you look in India, rich spoiled brats, the Aurangzeb Road, APJ Abdul Kalam Road, Prithviraj Road types, they tend to be obnoxious towards their social inferiors, and they only treat you as an equal if you're as obnoxious as them. It is, and you see it across society out here. Here, politeness is seen as a sign of weakness, and obnoxiousness is seen as a sign of strength, unfortunately, whether we like it or not. So, China keeps treating us like dirt. And remember, this was a statement that I think it was Kennedy who made it in 1962, that, China keeps goes on slapping Nehru, and he keeps pretending that the slaps never happened. Even today, after 20 of our soldiers have been killed, we are unable to call them an aggressor. We are unable to call them a hostile power. Even the way we, blacklist their companies, we're still not committing to kicking Huawei and co out of our 5G competition. It's more of a rumor floating around, which will get withdrawn after a point of time, rather than a hard ban saying, you know what, no more Chinese companies. You just have to notify. Notice the language coming out. They have to notify if they're from a neighboring country and so on and so forth. So there is this fundamental issue out here. The second problem, which I think both the Americans and, mind you, the Russians also get very upset by this, is the fact that unfortunately in India, our diplomacy is all about, over-promising and under-delivering. And that is beginning to roost. I don't know why we do that as a diplomatic tactic, but unfortunately we do that. And then, of course, there's the larger question of and this has been amply demonstrated by what's happened after Galwan, that you're still not able to decide who your friends are and who your enemies are. And the same people that were saying, we don't want to lose strategic autonomy, la-di-da-di-da, are now saying, this is where we should bring the Quad in, but they don't want the Quad in any meaningful sort of way. This is a confusion that we have to sort out.
So Abhijit, just extending this argument, I want to know from you, from the point of global geopolitics. A generation of Indian engineers found employment in America. They found prosperity there. That money was flowed back into Indian companies. A lot of money came in from America and India, which was Indians who were earning. So we earned a lot from America. They took our intellectual capital, which is all right. But they grew there. They made their billions of dollars. That money came back to India. Do you think that the potential of this relationship hasn't realized its true potential as yet?
It was never going to realize, because look, we never adopted a sort of capitalist model. We've got fantastically intelligent people, but we never actually give them the tools to sort of help themselves. Erratic fiscal policy, no real help towards MSMEs and things like that. It's a very anti-business environment and continues to be a very anti-business environment. But then remember, it's not unique to India. Say Germany or France have fantastically innovative people, but why is it that Silicon Valley is only based in California? Because in Germany, if you go bankrupt once, the bank will never give you a loan ever again. It doesn't matter how good your proposal is. But in California, they don't care how many times you've failed. They're risk-taking enough to evaluate a proposal on its merits. And this is just a single example. production, innovation, all of these things, they're multi-causal. It's many sort of things coming together. In India, when people want to come in, what happens? We don't roll out, they're still bogged down by bureaucratic red tape and things like that. And there are things that are completely stilted. For example, land prices. You look, IKEA paid more for their Delhi showroom than they've had to for any other showroom anywhere in any of their locations in their entire history, right? And it's quite far off. It shouldn't cost that much. It's a very skewed, and it's not even natural flows to supply and demand. We all know construction is probably the most corrupt industry, and in spite of RERA, we thought RERA was going to correct a lot of these inefficiencies and market skewing. It hasn't, because you still have these builders squatting on land. So, it's there's a fundamental laziness of policy out here, which will never allow us to realize that full potential of Indian Americans. That said,
yes,
we should also remember Indian Americans in America tend to be extremely socialistic, right? They're extremely woke. You look at the polls that came out, I think, day before yesterday or last week, they're all for public spending, socialism, and all that nonsense.
So now one more point.
And they tend to gravitate towards the Democrat Party. They tend to gravitate, they don't have a sense of being Indian except culturally.
Okay. So I have to ask you this. Russia currently, was the focus of all attention after India's conflict, so to speak, in Ladakh. We saw our defense minister rushing there. And of course, there was some kind of an understanding that Russia is playing some role. Could you explain us what's happening?
Right. So that was quite natural because, see, we trust the Russians fundamentally. Because remember, despite everything you may say about the Russian relationship, they still give us technology that they won't even dream of giving to the Chinese. They helped us with the Arihant and the Arigat, the entire nuclear submarine project. And even you remember when the American sanctions came on, space sanctions, it was Glavkosmos, their company, that gave us the cryogenic engine technology and all of that. So the political trust between Russia and India remains very deep. And the Russians fundamentally, well, the Chinese also trust the Russians. The Chinese and Russians have this sort of arrangement that Russia feels intensely threatened by China, but they won't do anything militarily. And also China allows Russia to play the big boss, the bad cop in international relations. If you look publicly, even though China is pulling the strings, they let Russia front any diplomatic campaign that they do. Syria and all of that, if you remember all those contentious issues that came up, it was Russia that was taking the diplomatic lead, not China. So there's that, as an interlocutor, Russia has the trust of both India and China. And I think that was a very important role to play. Not that much came out of it, of course, because, if you've got two countries that are at loggerheads, the third country, you need to have economic tools to force compliance, which is what America can do. This is why America can force Israel and the Palestinians on the table, or Israel and the UAE and Bahrain on the table. And Russia can't, because the economic tools the global integration of markets between India and Russia won't allow Russia to use that sort of mild coercive power.
So now look at it. There are elections in America upcoming. And there are a lot of, things are spoken in hushed tones that even this has an impact, or something is related to India and China. This is gossip. Is there any merit, or it's just mere gossip?
I suspect that, it's... if you want to take a full-on conspiracy theory line, if 2016 was Russia-gate, I do believe 2020 is China-gate. And I'll tell you why. Because you look at the shutting down of the consulate in Texas.
Yes.
You look at the fact that the Chinese are actually paying Black Lives Matter protesters. This is a matter of record that they've been paying Black Lives Matters. The problem is the Chinese aren't as nuanced and sophisticated as the Russians. What the Russians can do, the Chinese, because the Chinese business model and intelligence gathering model is to go straight to the top, fall for the delusions of the top leadership, and bribe the top leadership. And the Democrats actually believe that Black Lives Matter is helping them, whereas I honestly think, if you go by conspiracy theories, that Black Lives Matter is actually a secret conspiracy by Trump, because the people most getting affected by these riots are Black and colored businesses that live in those that operate in those down market areas, which is why you've seen Trump's popularity with Black Americans boost from something like 7% to 30-something% at the moment, if I'm not mistaken. Huge jump. It's still not a majority, but it's a massive, massive jump over what happened the last time. And these rioters have just succeeded in alienating everyone around them. So if China is interfering in elections, I think unwittingly they're actually helping Trump get elected.
Okay, that's interesting. I want to know, in the next 4 or 5 months, I know I can't, in a sense, ask this question because nobody knows really what happens tomorrow, but where is this heading in your view? Because the build-up only continues.
With
China.
With Chinese border situation, right? So I think the first thing we have to understand is that the price that we're paying in human lives is the cost of changing the status quo. And where India changed the status quo, and we've seen this through satellite imagery starting from May 2019 when this government was sworn in, the second term of this government was sworn in, is that the infrastructure construction along the border has been massive. And this is also, it's a change of political mindset, but it's also a change of military mindset. As long as we were a ground-centric force, ki army sab kuch karega, it was roads are a bad thing because you are building an invasion highway for the Chinese to come in. When you move to an air-centric paradigm, and we should have seen this with Balakot, because you remember Balakot was the first example of the Indian government going in for air retaliation as opposed to ground-based retaliation. When you look at it from an air planner, you see that roads are a very good thing because they kind of channel your enemy forces into a narrow, thin line where you can take them off your own way at your own time and place of choosing. So what we're seeing is we are paying the price for changing the status quo and building a lot of infrastructure on our side of the LAC. But projecting that out, what's going to happen is the Chinese are going to be forced to accept that status quo. You may see a lot of flare-ups happen because they broke the consensus of not getting lethal on the border. And that, mind you, that was a breakdown of standards and procedures and protocols that had worked perfectly for the last 40 years. I still believe it was a blunder. But what you're going to see here on is consistent low-level military actions of one sort or another. If you look at the build-up, for example, in Spangur, in the Spangur Gap, in the lake Spangur, just south of Pangong, they've got tanks and artillery on their side. We've got tanks and artillery on our side. Now, what if without firing a shot, they just start moving their tanks down the plain? If they move, are you willing to fire the first shot to stop them? The consequences of that will be too great. I don't think local commanders are authorized to fire shots these days, but to actually fire an anti-tank round or an anti-tank shell, I don't think this has been resolved completely. Expect a lot of flare-ups to happen. This is going to be the new normal. This high tension, possibly low level conflict is going to be on for at least a year, year and a half, 2 years. But worryingly, what I'm hearing from Beijing is that Xi Jinping is hopping mad with us and he wants us to be taught a lesson. So it might get actually quite a bit hotter as well. I'm not seeing any signs of it getting hotter, but we're definitely seeing that they're building the infrastructure on their side to make it hotter. Before this, from Ladakh to Arunachal, there were only 6 heliports. Each heliport was, they weren't just pads. They were full on with hangars and things like that. There were only 6. Within the space of 2 months, they built 24. Right? All within a few hundred kilometers of the LAC. So there is something coming, unfortunately. How intense or how vicious it's going to get, we don't know. But it may even come after about 6 to 9 months when people think it's not going to come. But something's going to happen.
Abhijit,
because this is an untenable situation.
Abhijit, this is worrying. It is worrying. But more than worrying, I want to know, this is a country that we allow $65 billion trade surpluses. Then why do you get treated this way because the whole narrative until 2014 was that we're going to change it, but we continued that policy. The narrative, if you remember, 2011, 12, 13, 14, all the thinkers, so-called of the right, they said, no, this is going to change. We are not going to allow China these kind of surpluses. We will also export. But subtly that policy was continued. The trade deficits only grew. But in return for this kind of a business that we give China, why do you think this happens?
Look, it's dependency, because I think historically, if you look at it, when you have a colonial nature of trade, and I'll explain that later, the colonizing power is incentivized to invade its raw materials provider. So you look at Rome's, conquest of Gaul, Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul. It goes back much earlier than that. That's why Japan attacked Indonesia, conquered Indonesia and all of that in the Second World War, because they needed fuel and supplies, and they wanted to attack Northern Australia for the minerals and things like that. This has been a standard pattern, and this goes back to the first question you asked me about China, how China hasn't matured into a modern capitalist state. It remains an aggressive mercantilist state that seeks to control raw materials. Now, you look at the nature. When I said a colonial nature of trade, the nature of India-China trade is no different from the nature of India-Britain trade when we were colonized by the British, which is to say India provides China with the raw materials and they provide us with finished goods. The issue is because India has, in the last last 20, 30 years technically, just refused to get onto the manufacturing bandwagon because of all our socialism. How are we going to change that? We're still an extremely price-sensitive, not quality-conscious, but price-conscious market that depends on cheap Chinese phones. Your entire services-based industry, we've got, unlike a third-world country, and very like a first-world country, services accounts for a disproportionate percentage of our GDP. And that entire service sector is based on low-cost IT imports from China, Huawei and things like that.
That's a very fair point. I'd like to end this because we completely out of time on today's show by saying what Sheshadri Chari said. Sheshadri Chari made a very good point when he said that out of this bulk of companies leaving China, they're going to Vietnam. Barely any coming to India. That's worry, because we thought they're all coming to my country, our country. It's not happening. So Sheshadri Chari made a very fair point, and it trended for some time. But Abhijit, I would like to thank you for sparing your time for today's episode. We will do a couple of more such episodes to understand how this whole situation is evolving and how the India-China trade deal, if at all it happens, how will it happen? Because that's a very important issue now. But we would request your time in the next episode on policy and politics for this. But I would like to thank you for sharing your time today with us.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.